You selling trash. That bracelet's not worth a damn penny. Laughter from the biker gang ripped through the gas station. The leader snatched the bracelet from the woman's hand, threw it to the ground, and crushed it under his boot until the silver bent out of shape. Get on your knees and beg I might toss you a few coins to feed your mother. The woman didn't move. Her eyes were cold, her voice rough from the wind. Don't do that. That bracelet once sat in Magnus Thorne's safe, the man who pays for your gas. No one laughed anymore. One biker knelt squinting at the faint engraving beneath the grime, the logo Aurum Signa. The group froze. The woman spoke again, calm and steady. I'm not begging. I'm taking back what he stole from my mother. Her name was Saren Alray, and she stood there wind-tugging at her faded jacket, her hair tied back with a plain elastic. She wasn't tall, wasn't loud, didn't wear anything that screamed money or power. But there was something about her. The way her hands stayed steady as she picked up the bent bracelet. The way her eyes didn't flinch even as the bikers loomed over her. She wasn't just some nobody selling junk at a gas station. But nobody there knew that yet. Not the bikers, not the cashier watching from the window, not even the old man pumping gas who'd overheard the whole thing and turned away. The gas station sat on the edge of town, where the asphalt cracked and the neon flickered. Kale Dravik, the leader of the Black Veins, leaned against his bike, his leather jacket creaking. He was all sharp edges, tattoos curling up his neck, a smirk that said he owned the ground he stood on. He looked Saren up and down, taking in her scuffed shoes, her plain gray sweater. You got some nerve, he said, spitting on the ground. Talking about Magnus Thorne, like you know him, you think you're somebody. Another biker Ridge stepped forward. He was younger, wiry with a buzz cut and a chip on his shoulder. Look at her, he said loud enough for the whole lot to hear. She's probably stealing that bracelet from some thrift store bin. What's it made of, tin? You weld it together in your mama's garage. The others laughed, a low rumble that spread like wildfire. Ridge grabbed the bracelet again, holding it up to the light. This thing's fake as your story, sweetheart. He tossed it into the dirt again, stomping it deeper into the gravel. Serene knelt slowly, her fingers brushing the bracelet's twisted shape. She didn't rush, didn't tremble. The bikers kept talking, their voices piling on. Go back to the gutter. One said, what's a broke chick like you doing out here anyway? Another added, his gold chain glinting as he leaned forward. They were a pack feeding off each other's cruelty, each jab sharper than the last. A woman in a tight red dress hanging off one of the bikes giggled and pointed. Her mom probably hasn't eaten because she's too busy drinking. The laughter spiked harsh and jagged, cutting through the evening air. Serene stood, the bracelet cradled in her palm. She didn't look at the woman or the bikers. Her eyes locked on Kale. You're wrong about one thing, she said, her voice low but clear. It's not fake. She turned the bracelet over, letting the faint Aurum Signa logo catch the fading sunlight. The group went quiet for a split second, like the air had been sucked out of the lot. Kale's smirk faltered, but he recovered fast. You're full of it, he said. That logo don't mean nothing. Aurum Signa's been dead for years. She didn't argue. She just slipped the bracelet into her pocket and started walking toward the gas station door. The bikers shouted after her, their voices blending into a wall of noise. Run home, beggar. Nobody's buying your sob story. But Saren didn't turn back. The way she moved slow, deliberate, her shoulders straight, made it clear she wasn't running from anything. She pushed open the door, the bell jingling faintly, and disappeared inside. Inside, the cashier, a middle-aged guy with a stained apron, glanced up from his phone. You okay? He asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Serene nodded, pulling out her phone. Her fingers moved quickly, snapping a photo of the bracelet's bent edge, the logo still visible despite the damage. She sent it somewhere nobody could see where. The cashier watched her, curious but didn't ask. Outside, the bikers were still laughing, their bikes roaring as they peeled out of the lot. Years ago, Saren's mother Elira stood in a workshop filled with light. Her hands moved over silver and stone, shaping pieces that collectors fought over. Aurum Signa wasn't just a brand, it was her life's work. Saren, barely a teenager then, would sit on a stool watching her mother carve delicate patterns into metal. Elira's voice was soft but firm. This is who we are, she'd say, holding up a finished piece. Not the money, not the name, the work. But that was before Magnus Thorne, with his tailored suits and cold smile, walked into their lives. Before he promised partnerships, then stole everything. Back at the gas station, Taran Vex, the Black Veins' second-in-command, hadn't said a word during the scene. He stood apart from the others, his dark eyes fixed on the bracelet's logo, before Saren pocketed it. Taran was different, quieter, sharper, the kind of guy who noticed things others missed. He'd seen that logo before, years ago, when he was just a kid apprenticing at a jeweler's shop. A woman had come in her hands calloused but gentle, fixing a broken clasp for him when no one else would. She'd worn a pendant with that same logo. Aurum Sign. Taryn's jaw tightened as he climbed onto his bike, the memory nagging at him. Kyle didn't notice Taryn's silence. He was too busy reveling in the moment, his voice booming as he recounted the beggar girl to the others at their clubhouse later that night. The place was a mess of beer cans and cigarette smoke, the walls plastered with posters of bikes and women. "She thought she could pull one over on us," Kyle said, leaning back in a worn leather chair. "Talking about Magnus Thorne like she's got dirt on him." The others laughed, but Taryn stayed quiet, his phone buzzing in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from E.S. Archives. His heart skipped. He didn't open it, not yet. Serene, meanwhile, was back in the tiny apartment she shared with her mother. Elira lay on a thin mattress in the corner, her breathing shallow, her face pale under the dim light. Serene set the bracelet on a small table, next to a bottle of pills she couldn't afford to refill. She didn't cry, didn't pace. She just sat there, her hands folded, staring at the bracelet's bent shape. The logo was still there, faint but unmistakable. She picked up her phone again, checking the message she'd sent at the gas station. No reply yet. But she wasn't waiting for a miracle. She was waiting for a chance. A few days later, Seren stood outside a pawn shop, the bracelet in her hand again. The owner, a wiry man with greasy hair and a permanent sneer, leaned over the counter, eyeing her like she was a stray dog. "This thing's barely worth the metal it's made of," he said, flicking the bracelet with his finger. A couple of customers nearby snickered one, muttering, "She looks like she crawled out of a ditch to sell that." Seren's fingers tightened around the bracelet, but her face stayed calm. She slid it back into her pocket and turned to leave her boots scuffing the worn floor. As she reached the door, the owner called out, "Come back when you've got something worth my time." She paused, her hand on the knob, and said without turning, "You'll regret that." Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the room go still. The next day, word started to spread. Someone at the gas station had overheard Seren's words about Magnus Thorne. By noon, it had reached the wrong ears. Magnus himself sat in his office high above the city, his desk gleaming under fluorescent lights. He was a man who looked like he owned the world. Gray suit, slicked back hair, a watch that cost more than most people's houses. His assistant handed him a phone. "It's Kale," she said. Magnus listened, his face unreadable. "If you see her again," he said, his voice smooth as glass, "make sure she knows her place." Kale didn't waste time. He and his crew tracked Seren to a rundown market in the city's poorest corner. She'd set up a small table, the bracelet laid out on a scrap of cloth. A few people stopped curious, but most walked by. Kyle's bike roared as he pulled up his crew, fanning out behind him. "Well, look who's back," he said, his voice carrying over the chatter of the market. "The little princess of trash." He grabbed the bracelet, holding it up like a trophy. This belonged in a museum or a dumpster. The crowd parted, watching. A woman with overdone makeup and a fake smile stepped forward, Lila, the kind who thrived on status and gossip. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice dripping with pity. "You're embarrassing yourself. Go home." Another man, a local vendor with a gold tooth and a loud laugh, joined in. "What's next? Selling your socks. Nobody wants your junk." The laughter spread sharp and mean as Kale tossed the bracelet into a nearby storm drain. It clattered against the metal grate and vanished. Seren stood there, her table splintered, her hands empty. Dust clung to her face, smudged across her cheek. The crowd kept jeering, but she didn't flinch. She looked at Coyle, her voice steady despite the chaos. "You're repeating your parents' mistakes." The words landed like a slap. Kyle's face twisted, but before he could respond, Seren turned and walked away, her steps slow but sure. The crowd's laughter faded uncertain as she disappeared into the alley. At the market's edge, a young girl no older than 10 stood clutching a tattered backpack. She'd watched the whole scene, her eyes wide, her fingers twisting the strap. Seren paused as she passed, noticing the girl's trembling hands. Without a word, she reached into her bag, pulled out a small silver pendant, an older Aurum Signa piece, not the bracelet, and pressed it into the girl's palm. "Hold on to this," Seren said, her voice soft. "It's worth more than they think." The girl stared at the pendant, then at Seren, her mouth opening, but no words coming out. Seren didn't wait for a response. She kept walking, the weight of the moment settling in the girl's eyes behind her. Taryn wasn't there that day. He was across town standing in an abandoned jewelry shop, its windows boarded up, its shelves coated in dust. He'd remembered the logo, the woman from years ago. He found a box in the back filled with old sketches and tools. One sketch caught his eye, a bracelet design identical to Seren's, with the Aurum Signa logo etched in the corner. His hands shook as he realized who Seren's mother was. Elira Al-Ray had saved him once, back when he was a nobody before Magnus Thorne's empire swallowed everything. That night, Taryn found Serene at a bus stop, sitting alone under a flickering streetlight. He approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You're fighting a war you can't win," he said, his voice low. Serene didn't look up. She pulled a crumpled paper from her bag, a photocopy of an old contract. Elira's signature forged at the bottom. "Magnus thought he buried this," she said. "He didn't." Taryn took the paper, his eyes scanning the text. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew she wasn't just fighting for her mother. She was tearing down an empire. The city buzzed with rumors the next week. Serene's name started popping up, whispers about Elira's daughter and Aurum Signa. Magnus felt the heat. He called Coyle again, his voice sharper this time. "Find her. End this." Cale didn't ask questions. He and his crew tracked Serene to a busy downtown street, their bikes weaving through traffic. She was walking alone, her bag slung over her shoulder. Kyle revved his engine, cutting her off. She stumbled, falling to her knees, the bracelet slipping from her bag and hitting the pavement. It cracked in half, the silver splitting is clean. Kyle laughed loud and cruel. "That's what you get for thinking you're bigger than you are." He shouted, his voice echoing off the buildings. The crowd gathered, phones out recording. Serene sat there, blood on her lip, her hands steady as she picked up the broken pieces. She looked up at Cole, her eyes sharp. "Magnus used to call my mother his superior," she said. "Funny how, you're both wrong." The crowd murmured, confused. Cale's grin faded, but he shook it off, revving his bike and speeding away. In the chaos, a street vendor nearby, an older woman with a cart full of flowers, watched Serene pick up the broken bracelet. She shuffled over her hands, gnarled from years of work, and pressed a single daisy into Serene's hand. "You don't let him break you," she said, her voice rough but kind. Serene looked at the flower, her fingers closing around it. She didn't speak, but her eyes softened just for a moment before she stood and walked away. The vendor watched her go, muttering to herself, "That girl's got fire they don't see." What nobody saw was the tiny chip glinting in the broken bracelet. Serene picked it up, her fingers careful, and slipped it into her pocket. Later that night, in a cramped motel room, she met Taryn again. He brought a laptop, old but functional. They plugged the chip in, and the screen lit up with files, contracts, signatures, proof that Magnus had forged Elira's name to steal Aurum Signa. Taryn's hands froze on the keyboard. "This is enough to bury him," he said. Serene nodded. "Send it to Orrin Vale." Detective Orrin Vale was a shadow from the past. Years ago, he'd investigated Elira's downfall, but Magnus's money had shut him down. Now, with the chip's data in his inbox, he sat in his car staring at the screen. The signatures were real. The dates matched. He made a call, his voice quiet but firm. "We're reopening the case." Across town, Magnus's phone buzzed with bad news. His accounts were frozen. His investors were pulling out. He slammed his fist on his desk, but it didn't change a thing. The Black Veins didn't know what was coming. Cale, still loyal to Magnus, thought he could fix things. He and his crew stormed Serene's apartment, cameras rolling for a live stream. They wanted to humiliate her, make her beg for forgiveness on air. Lila was there, her fake smile back, directing the camera. "Tell the world you're a fraud," she said, her voice syrupy. Kyle leaned in, his breath hot. "Say it, or we'll make sure your mom starves." Serene stood in the middle of the room, her hands empty, her face calm. The camera zoomed in, catching the faint scar on her cheek from the fall. She looked straight into the lens. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear. "You just broadcast evidence of an international crime." The screen behind her flickered to life, the chip's data streaming across it, Magnus's forged signatures, bank records, emails. The live stream chat exploded, viewers typing in all caps. Kyle's face went pale. Lila dropped her phone. As the police sirens wailed closer, a neighbor, an older man with a limp and a worn cap, stood in the hallway outside Serene's apartment. He'd heard the commotion, seen the bikes pull up. When the cops arrived, he pointed them to the right door, his voice steady. "She's no fraud," he said, clutching a small Aurum Signa ring he'd bought years ago before Elira's fall. "That girl's the real deal." The officers nodded, pushing past him. but his words hung in the air, a quiet defiance that echoed Seren's own. The police moved fast. By morning, they were at Magnus's mansion, cuffing him as he shouted about his lawyers. His Empire Thorn Luxuries was unraveling. Taryn led the detectives to the old jewelry shop, showing them the sketches, the proof. Call was picked up an hour later, charged with obstruction of justice. His bike sat abandoned in the precinct lot, its chrome dull under the gray sky. Lila's social media accounts went dark after the live stream, her sponsors dropping her overnight. Elira appeared on the news that evening, her voice weak but steady. She sat in a wheelchair, her hands folded, a faint smile on her face. "Justice takes time," she said, "but it never stays quiet." Serene stood beside her, her arm around her mother's shoulders. The cameras caught the moment their hands clasped, their eyes bright with tears and something stronger. The headline ticker read, "Aurum Signi Reborn, the Fall of Thorn Luxuries." Kale didn't go down quietly. From his cell, he laughed when a guard mentioned Seren's name. "She thinks she won," he said, his voice bitter. "The world's still gonna call her the beggar girl." A tabloid picked up the story, splashing an old photo of Serene at the gas station, her face tired, her clothes plain. The headline screamed, "Fake hero" or "Clever con." Serene saw it at a newsstand, her fingers pausing on the paper. She didn't buy it. She just kept walking. Magnus got one last shot. In a holding cell, he leaned across the table when Serene came to see him. His suit was wrinkled now, his hair unkempt. "You won," he said, his voice low, "but you lost faith in people. That's worse." Serene looked at him, her eyes steady. "No," she said, "I just stopped believing in thieves." She stood, her bag slung over her shoulder, and walked out. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound final. In the weeks that followed, Serene visited a community center where locals gathered, many of them struggling like she had. She didn't speak much, but she set up a small display of her mother's old designs, letting people touch the metal, feel the weight of the work. A woman in a faded coat approached her, hands shaking as she picked up a pendant. "I had one like this," she said, her voice breaking. "Lost it when things got bad." Serene slid the pendant across the table. "It's yours now," she said. The woman's eyes welled up, and for a moment, the room felt warmer, like a weight had lifted. A year later, Serene stood in a small shop, its windows bright with morning light. The sign above read, "Al Rey Atelier." Inside, Elira sat on an old wooden chair, her hands steady as she polished a new piece. Taryn stopped by, holding a silver bracelet, its design simple but perfect. "Like the one you sold?" he said, smiling. "But this one's for a new start." Serene took it, her fingers tracing the Aurum Signa logo. She didn't say much, just nodded, her eyes soft. Kale got a package in prison one day. No note, no name, just the original bracelet. Its bent edges smoothed out, a new engraving on the back. "Value isn't in the metal." He stared at it, his hands tight around the bars. Outside, the world kept turning. Lila lost her last sponsor, her name fading from the city's gossip circles. Ridge, the wiry biker, was let go from his job after the live stream, his face too recognizable now. Serene and Elira walked out of the shop one morning, the sun just breaking over the skyline. The new Aurum Signa sign glowed above them, its letters sharp and proud. Elira squeezed her daughter's hand, her voice quiet. "You turned our scars into light," she said. Serene smiled, her eyes on the horizon. They didn't need to say more. The truth was in the work in the shop, in the bracelet on the table inside. Some fights don't end with a cheer. They end with a step forward, a hand held, a door opened. Serene didn't need the world to clap for her. She'd done what she came to do. And for anyone who'd ever been pushed down, counted out, or laughed at her story, was a quiet nod. You weren't wrong. You weren't alone. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.